All right. Good morning, everyone, and welcome. Good morning, live participants. Thank you for being here. And thank you to all of those participating via Zoom this morning. Good morning. I'm Dr. Deborah Montoya here from Imperial County SELPA in all things improving outcomes for English learners with disabilities. We're going to go ahead and get started. Our project is funded by the California Department of Education and the California Collaborative for Educational Excellence. So we thank CDE and CCEE for their partnership and support information across the state to ensure that we support and uplift all of the needs of our multilingual learners statewide in California. It is a webinar format today, so do please connect with us. Although we are far away in Zoom, know that you can chat with us and enter items in the Q&A as you see appropriate. We're always learning from your comments and feedback and want to hear from you. Our in-person participants will have the opportunity to ask questions live as well so that we can all engage together as we work through and support each other in honing our craft and improving outcomes for English learners with disabilities. So the format is just a little bit as a webinar because we can't have you unmute and join as there are many participants statewide engaging with us, but nevertheless, again, chat with us. Q&A feature is enabled so that we can continuously comment, chat, and answer any questions as they come up. So do know that I'll be helping moderate. All four of us will be moderating at one point in time in the chat box. So again, we hope that you engage with us. As we plan our day, do know that we understand that it is difficult to sit in our seat. We have lots of things going on and lots of information to unpack. So we will try to take a break every hour on the hour or half hour, I should say, 8:30, 9:30, 10:30. We will have lunch at 11:30, have a full hour, and then return promptly at 1:30 so we can end our day. Again, I'm Dr. Deborah Montoya. I'm the Senior Director at Imperial County SELPA, and I have my wonderful colleagues with me here today. Lupita Olguin-Rubio, a coordinator, EL specialist, who works in all things general education and now special education as we build our collaborative commitment, both general educators and special educators. Vanessa Lopez will be our lead presenter today as we get started this morning, and lots of wealth of information, all things assistive technology, APE, special education, resource, and special day. So again, knowing her expertise is also being an EL coach and support. Christina Zavala is our newest member of our team, past school psychologist as well as special education director. And in her leadership, we will also continue this afternoon in discussing special education assessment and potential eligibility. So we have lots to cover today as we share our knowledge and expertise with you, but you as experts in the field, we'd like to know who you are. So if you don't mind entering in the chat your name, your district, county office, or SELPA, and your respective position and role. It also helps us better understand how we gear and navigate and answer some of your questions. And we hope that there's a wealth of general educators and as much as special educators as we work together to improve outcomes for English learners with disabilities. It truly takes all of us to leverage our knowledge and expertise, as this is a very complicated intersectionality as we consider English learners and students with disabilities and their unique needs given their individual disability. So again, those on Zoom, we'd love to hear from you. Those in person, I think we all know each other, which is wonderful. We have a great community of supporters here in Imperial County. All of the resources for today are included in a Padlet to include the presentation slides, all of the resources for which there's more than we will actually go through today, but they're all available to you, free to use. Any documents that you see, feel free to download them, rebrand them, use them as you see appropriate to support your respective teams at your school sites. So the slide deck, all the information is on the Padlet. If you choose to remake the Padlet, that's great. But do know that if you missed last section 1 session, it will be recorded and then future sessions will also be on the Padlet with all the documents. So you might just want to keep that link and have it there because we continue to refresh and replenish it and add to it as time goes on. So again, that Padlet is there for you. And where are we? Here in Imperial County, SELPA, we are in the southernmost eastern region in California and part of this greater system of support. The California system of support is available to all districts, school sites to provide that support needed where you see that need, meeting you where you are, where you see gaps in practices. It just so happens that our content lead as a SELPA is English learners students with disabilities. So that is our focus area in improving outcomes for English learners with disabilities. But yet we have other SELPAs that can provide assistance and support in UDL, support systems for children with autism, in addition to open access with AT and UDL, and South County with disproportionality. So as you consider all of the geographic leads, your county offices as supports, again, working together to assist you at your respective school sites. To learn a little bit more about the grant work that is working through Imperial County, improving outcomes for English learners, we do have a one-page infographic as we do discuss all things and provide technical assistance all the way from multi-tiered system of supports, MTSS, all the way through assessment and, yes, reclassification of English learners with disabilities. So we hope that you connect with us. So let's get started in just some grounding for all of us as we discuss the needs of English learners. And we may use the term English learners, English language learners, multilingual learners. Again, as we look towards an assets-based approach, you will hear us use more of the term multilingual learners. Multilingual learners, again, being students who have a primary language other than English in their home. We follow that federal guideline, that state, again, home language survey, if you will, which we discussed last time in section 1. So as we think of students who have a primary language other than English. Students with disabilities, again, definition very clear as you see it there. And when we refer to students with disabilities, we are making also some assumptions that these are students who have been assessed comprehensively with validity and reliability, and that they qualify for special education supports and services under one of those 13 disability categories as indicated under IDEA 04. So as we consider students with disabilities and English learners, we also acknowledge the fact that being an English learner, a multilingual language student, in and of itself does not qualify a student for special education and or services, neither under ADA nor IDEA. So we'll be talking about that intersection later as we go through pre-referral and considerations for students who are multilingual learners where teams may be considering that referral for special education and the appropriateness of that referral. But let's set a little bit of context as we go through all the different documents that inform our practice and that has also guided us in our work as we consider all things and needs for multilingual learners and students with disabilities. And we start with the ELD standards back in 2012, California having adopted and aligned those standards craftfully. We look to the ELD standards as our guidance and support as we look to assuring that all multilingual learners receive comprehensive ELD and supports. The ELA and the ELD framework and that relationship when looking at culturally and linguistically sustaining pedagogy is so important. And then we move forward a few years to 2015, and we began that conversation regarding multi-tier system of support. So our last session focused on MTSS, and now we'll continue with that conversation as we consider what interventions exist and how those interventions craft and support your supports for students, and how, again, educators are also learning and growing as they, again, assist the varied needs of the students at your respective school sites. The EL roadmap, we always focus and look at that first principle as we think about assets-oriented, needs-responsive schools. That we may all be able to get to that point where we're responsive to the needs of every student who crosses the threshold and enters our educational system. And that's a challenge as we all work to assist our students, to support our students and families, and work together as respective communities, regardless of where we are across California. And then, of course, we look at the California system of support, which we, again, are grateful to be able to be part of that system of support in improving outcomes for English learners with disabilities. But as our love and our passion, our foundational work that we will discuss today is the California Practitioner's Guide for Educating English Learners with Disabilities. That is our focal resource. The resources that we share with you are from that resource. We thank all of the experts who came together to build the resources, to build that California Practitioner's Guide that provides us with best practice as we all work together to identify, assess, support, reclass, all things in support of English learners who may qualify qualify for special education, who may not, but ensuring that we are providing the best possible practices and supports needed by our multilingual learners and our multilingual learners with disabilities. So our grounding resource is the California Practitioner's Guide. Specifically today, our focus will be Section 2 of the California Practitioner's Guide, but we also ask that always follow your district policies and practices. From time to time, we'll ask you to be reflective on what are your current procedures. Sometimes our actual practice is maybe not the same as the procedure that's documented. And as close that we can get to supporting students is ensuring that are our policies and practices in line with state and federal mandates. What does that look like at each respective school site? As we also recognize that school sites within districts, there may be variance in the practices, the policies, and potentially even the interventions that we use to support and assist our multilingual learners. So we'll share with you our best practices, our expertise and knowledge in this field as you also consider what exists at your school sites and where potentially there may be gaps in practice as well, as we work through sometimes even that discomfort of knowing there may be a gap in practice and how we can work to remedy that, and who are allies and partners, that we move away from silos and work together, EL specialists, special educators, curriculum and instruction, all of us in support of our students. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Vanessa Lopez, who will take us through Section 2 and get us started. Thank you, Vanessa.
Thank you, Debbie. Can I borrow the baton? Very important. Thank you so much. Hello, everybody. Good morning. Welcome. Thank you, everybody joining us live, and also those of you joining us via Zoom. So as Debbie alluded to, today we're going to be focusing on all things Section 2. So Section 2, as denoted on the slide, is all things pre-referral, referral, assessment, and the IEP process. So when we're talking about pre-referral and referral, assessment, and the IEP process, we're going to be gleaning a lot from Section 1's content. So building, right? We're looking at building and just developing this formal understanding of how it is that we're going to support our students who might be pushed towards potential pre-referral activities, referral activities, perhaps assessment activities. So we're going to walk it through. When we do this, we're going to do this all through the context of Section 2. So Section 2 of the California Practitioner's Guide is all things pre-referral, referral, assessment, and the IEP process, but it's going to be broken down into 2 distinct chapters. So the content I will be covering today is all about Chapter 3, Special Education Referral Process for English Learners. As you know, the California Practitioner's Guide is a hefty document, and it's chock full of useful information that is supportive of our practice. As teachers, both general education, special education, school psychologists, speech and language pathologists, basically everybody that serves our students. Because it addresses such a broad variety of topics and audience members as well, it provides us various entry points. So when we're looking at Chapter 3, we're going to be looking at it through the lens of all thing referral process. So when we're talking about the referral process, there's a series of questions that we would want to consider. Questions that we would want to consider as teachers, practitioners, or as administrators. The way the chapters are structured is they set up these questions, they present them up front for us to learn so that we can expect what it is that we're going to be learning. When we're looking at the teacher perspective, we're going to be looking at the pre-referral steps and how these should be documented to ensure that special education referral for an English learner is appropriate. Additionally, we're going to look at information from parents. What do we need from parents? What do we need to know from them? What information is relevant? We also want to know what data do we need to collect so that we can make an appropriate referral. From the administrator standpoint, we're looking at the processes that are established to ensure that all of these referrals are appropriate and that they don't lead to over-identification or under-identification, which really is the crux of a lot of our conversations. Finally, from the administrator lens, we're going to look to ensure that we are meeting all state, federal child find requirements for English learners as well. So very broad yet focused, if that makes sense, right? So one of the things that I want to point out also is the inclusion of the Chapter 3 infographic. We've done this for every single chapter of the Practitioner's Guide. What the infographic does is it takes content from the document and presents it in a visual format. When presented in a visual format, it allows for learners of all kinds to be able to process the content. What is contained within this document are a series of live links that will connect you to either sections of the practitioner's guide that delve deeper, or to actual appendices or tables. When we look at this document, you can see some sections that are chunked out, and this is done in a manner so that it can be supportive of your practice. This is a resource that we hope you can stick in your back pocket and your toolkit of supports as you take this conversation back to your school site and build your own communities of practice or your professional learning communities. It is chunked out this way so that you can have meaningful conversation that is formatted and structured in a way that allows you to focus down deep, drill down into content that really takes into consideration the viewpoints of varied practitioners. Know that this is available for you to download. You can either save it, print it, download it in chunks, and you may utilize it further to enhance your conversations or to start those conversations that need to be had as we're looking to improve outcomes for multilingual learners who are students with disabilities. Okay, in a nutshell, chapter 3. Talked a lot, but now I'm going to focus us in on the actual conversation to be had today. And I say conversation because this truly is not just me speaking, but it's me prompting discussions, whether it be with your elbow partner or with future conversations with your teams at your school sites. We're going to be looking at identifying factors in the instructional environment for English language proficiency. We're going to be looking on how that progress is monitored, how it is that we review pertinent data, meaning intervention data, behavioral data, health data, as well as ruling out extrinsic factors. All of those things that might impact academic performance, behavior, social emotional needs, so that we can rule all of that out so that we can ensure that we are truly making an appropriate referral for special education. An appropriate referral. That's where I want us to really focus in on this conversation. Appropriate can be subjective, right? So we're going to help establish a couple of checkpoints that allow us to structure this conversation around what might that be. So I want to call your attention to this wheel, right? And it's a wheel on purpose because this is a process that is iterative. It is continuous and it doesn't stop. This is going to help us consider some points as we engage in the conversation around referral for special education eligibility. Again, not referral for special education full stop, but eligibility. And eligibility denotes that what? That there is specific criteria. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Right now, let's start with number 1. Number 1 talks about the referral, that initial referral for special education assessment to determine eligibility, which is started by staff, parent, guardian, counselor, really anybody. Next, we're going to be looking at the identification of the student's targeted needs via the team process. Okay, so think about your SST process. Think about whether it's called a student success team, a student study team, what process is established. Because as I'm going through the components of this wheel, I want you to be reflective of the processes established at your individual school sites. Or perhaps you're not aware, and that is okay. Because one of the points that we like to make when we have some time together, as we do today, is that this is not about the right way, the wrong way that you yourselves are doing things. It's about what is state federal mandate, what your written and unwritten processes look like, and building awareness. We realize that our audience is both special education, general education. And we have different experiences and connections with the educational system based on our current roles. So we might have a depth of knowledge on all things special education, but not enough on English language proficiency. Or tons of information when it relates to English language proficiency, the ELD standards, but not so much related to special education. So again, this conversation is to help strengthen those pathways, those connections from our silos, because I always make the case that we do need silos, we need specialists in areas, but enhancing that communication, right? So that identification piece of what the student's targeted needs via the team process is critical to this point because, as Debbie mentioned early on, being an English learner is not a disability. It is absolutely not a disability. So this is important from the get-go. From the get-go. Is that referral that's being initiated by somebody, is it relative to the needs of an English learner, or might it be related to a possible disability? One of the ways that we can help tease that out is by looking at point 3. Identification of the pre-referral activities tied to the identified areas of suspected student need and progress monitoring data. So what do we have in place? What activities have been developed, established, applied consistently, right? To help us gather some data that is truly going to inform the appropriateness of that referral for possible special education eligibility. And I call this out again specifically because when the referral is made, we need to be aware of what specifically are we targeting. And it would really help if what we're targeting isn't based on opinion only. So for that, we would need pre-referral activities and interventions that support that suspected area of need that you might consider could be related to a potential disability. Do these pre-referral activities match? Are we connecting the dots? Then we go into the referral for SPED assessment. So the referral's been made, we've identified targeted needs via the team process. We have some pre-referral activities that are inclusive of interventions, data monitoring, data collection, and now you have enough information to truly support a referral for SPED assessment. And that takes us into timelines now, right? That lovely special education timeline that we're always trying to get under so that we remain completely in service of students, right? We want to make sure that if there's truly a need, we get them those services and supports as soon as possible, right? And then after that assessment is sent out, the assessment plan is sent out, parents sign, it's returned, the assessment process begins, and then the 60-day timeline begins. We have a 60-day timeline that will allow us to get all the assessments completed, the completion of the evaluation full on, and the IEP development draft, of course, within the 60-day timeline, and then meet. So again, in a nutshell, this is the process. For our friends that are not super steeped in the world of special education, this might be the first time you hear that there's these really strict timelines that we need to comply with. But again, the process, overall process. So hopefully as I'm talking through this, you're thinking of your own processes. Were you aware of your site's process? Do you participate in that process? Who is involved in that process? Are you having some moments of affirmation where, yes, this is exactly what our process looks like? And it's great to hear that we are doing things that are in line with an appropriate referral process. Or, yes, largely this is what we're doing, but I think we need some tweaks in a certain area. Or you know what? I'm not aware. I don't know, and that's okay. And that's okay, because we are here together to dig a little deeper, Identify some supports that will get you on your way to enhancing your existing processes or delving a little deeper at a more granular level to receive some resources that will help you do that. So an anchor to our entire conversation on the pre-referral process is data. Constantly looking at data. And data isn't necessarily just spreadsheets. We're looking at multiple means of assessment, both formal and informal. We're looking at questionnaires, we're looking at conversation, we're looking at all sorts of data collection methods that you might have in place. Because a large portion of our content is now digital, a lot of that content then has some data collection method. A lot of our electronically delivered content is also linked to progress monitoring sometimes. So you're able to see what areas or topics a student is working on. That facilitates the conversation. It can be as simple as running a report, or it could be as complicated as having to go in there and build your report, dig in different places. But again, do we know where to go? Do we have a means of collecting data? Who are we having conversations with? If the student is an English learner, are we engaging with the ELD teacher? Are you the ELD teacher? What ELD data do you have? Again, all of these questions to prompt reflection as to what is going on in your individual sites. What is going on in the process? Do we have a process? Because really, what we're looking at is a four-prong approach for considerations prior to referral for special education eligibility. Figure 3.1 lays it out visually. We have the pre-referral activities, all those things that we just mentioned, right? The targeted areas, what interventions do we have, what data. Again, this is the process. This is a pre-referral process. We go into the student cumulative file check. We rule out or rule in extrinsic factors. And then we look at our intervention summary. Let's dig a little deeper there. So, pre-referral. The pre-referral process should be, highly encourage it, a multidisciplinary team approach. We know that the referral can be initiated by any staff member, a parent, guardian, counselor, anybody who suspects that there might be an additional need for the student. So again, anybody could make that referral, and this ends up in the hands of the student study team or the student success team. I want us to stop for a second and think. Who is in my student study team, student success team? How do I refer to the SST team? Is there a process? Are there forms? Are they electronic? Are they paper? Think of all those nuanced bits. Is everybody aware of the process? Are there situations where an SST might be escalated based on need? Again, reflection. Think about it. Who is involved? Are we rotating members? Is it always the same people? When we are referring a student in third grade, is the general education rep also the third grade teacher? All of those things matter. We urge you as a team to not look just for compliance, but to best practices. Yes, we would like to have a general education teacher there, but we would like to have somebody who's well-versed in the content that the student is having issues with. If the student is an English learner, is a core member of my SST team an EL specialist, an ELD TOSA, or somebody that has knowledge of the ELD standards and language acquisition. Because we need to tease out all those little intricacies that might begin to muddy the waters. So when it comes to tools to support this practice, because it can be overwhelming. I know I just posed a bunch of questions, and it's like, well, I don't know, that's so much to think about. The California Practitioner's Guide has put together a variety of resources that support these processes. One of the absolutely essential tools as you are looking at your own pre-referral process is the student cumulative file check. So the cum file can be a treasure trove of information. But you don't know what you're looking for if you don't know what you're looking for. So where to start? Appendix 3.2, which is the cum file check document, allows you to use this as a guiding document as you're looking for information. This appendix, like all of the appendices contained within the California Practitioner's Guide, is available for download. If you click on the link that's available on your screen, it should pop open the PDF version of it. We've extracted the appendices and made them standalone documents so that you can download and save locally to your device, fill, and print out. If you are in a situation where you're thinking, you know what, usually for the SST process, I just show up with work samples and I let the team know that this is what I have concerns about, but you don't have enough information as far as cum file resources relate, this is a great document for that. It allows you to really go in and have a focused data pool. You're pulling information that can be used to help determine the appropriateness of a potential referral for assessment. Just by looking at the first couple of entries here, we have basic information from student name, teacher, home language, whether they're English learners, LPAC scores, checking the cum file for schools attended, who registered the student, is there an IEP? Is there evidence of an SST or RTIT meeting? Any health vision concerns? Do we have attendance concerns? Fine motor concerns, gross motor concerns? Again, we're getting more information that is going to support the discussion and determining whether if this is an appropriate referral for SST, which it might be. We're not saying they're not. Or if this is something that, as I mentioned earlier, we need to escalate, because we've all been there, right? When we get a new student and we're going through the cum and we're looking at their performance in the classroom and something in your gut tells you, but then it's confirmed by the cumulative file check. But then it's confirmed by additional data. And it might mean that we don't have time to waste for some of our students. They need that support. So we need to start that process, right? And we can help expedite that process by collecting this information, by having that readily available. They might be new to our district, but at a previous district, an IEP existed. Okay, what happens next, right? Who do we talk to? Additionally, we're filling out this form. The student is an English learner. We're filling in the data for the LPAC, and then we look at the historical data, and they're fifth graders, and they've been a 1, 1, 1, 1, 1. Are there ELD interventions? So again, it prompts a lot of discussion, and that is what's important, because the student success team is where these conversations take place, to truly and fully support students in becoming successful. So we talked about the cumulative file check, but now we also want to either rule out or rule in extrinsic factors. And the cum file will typically get you started towards that direction. However, we know that we might need to dig a little bit deeper. Appendix 3.3 is a supportive tool to do just that. So when we're looking at Appendix 3.3, if you have access to your device, you can click on that link, pop it open so you can look at it fully as I'm talking about it. You'll see that here we're talking about the identification of the student's targeted needs via the team process, now looking specifically at extrinsic factors. If I go back to the student cum file check, we touched briefly on attendance, we touched briefly on evidence of additional interventions, but now we're looking specifically at areas that might impact learning. It's appropriate for us to not have all the answers, but this tool will help us get there. We have supports that are going to help us begin teasing out those potential extrinsic factors that could impact the student's performance. Looking at this very first page, you can see that, again, we have the basic student demographic data. We have a brief write-up that talks about the need to investigate extrinsic factors. And then we go into individual sections. Section A, the very first one you see up here, is about things, physical and psychological factors that may impact learning. And the structure of this document is the same throughout. Subheading section, a couple of questions that prompt reflection, thought, and to make a determination whether yes, it may be impacting. Does the student have access to healthcare? Yes, he does. No, she doesn't. Don't know, investigating. So it really does double duty. It helps you make a determination if yes or no, based on your level of information, based on that cum file check that you've already done at this point. And if not, it gives you a to-do list. All those investigating bullets that you mark off, that becomes your to-do. It might be that you don't know. Yeah, you want to investigate, but where do I start? Who do I ask? Again, prompting conversations, prompting questions, prompting relationship building. Who would I go to determine if these physical or psychological factors might be impacting learning? Who might help guide me? School nurse, health technician, whatever the title is at your school site for the person that oversees all things health. The psychologist, school counselor, who might you reach out to? Because we've made the point before that this is a multidisciplinary team approach. We are engaging with various individuals with very defined and distinct pools of knowledge, expertise, experience to help us make these determinations. Thinking back to my own practice, a lot of this investigation was done by the classroom teacher or just the case manager, and it was like a one-person show. There is so much to be said for highlighting our own blind spots. We need to be aware that we bring certain experiences and that we are going to be looking at certain student performance, interactions through our own experience. And there's nothing wrong with that. But we need to engage our peers that might have a different lens, a different experience, a different wealth of knowledge, a different silo, right? And we start building that scaffold, connecting them so we can dig deep and extract all that knowledge to serve students. Having collected all of that information then moves us forward towards the intervention summary. Thinking back to those first couple of prongs on that wheel for the considerations prior to special education eligibility assessment potential, we're looking at intervention summaries and building on the CUME file check, building on the extrinsic factors. Now we're looking at the actual activities and interventions. Last time we were together, we talked about the MTSS framework, inclusive of all things academics, behavioral, social, emotional. We talked about what's your tier 1, what's your tier 2, what's your tier 3. And maybe you were in a situation where you could list, this is tier 1, this is tier 2, this is tier 3. Perhaps you were in a situation where you didn't know. Hopefully that prompted conversation and investigation, because that is going to become critical when we are being reflective on the appropriateness of our processes when it comes to pre-referral. How can I progress monitor and data collect if I don't know what I'm progress monitoring and data collecting on? If the student shows up to the SST and the comment is, the student can't read. There's tons of components to reading. What specifically about reading is the student struggling in? We're talking about phonemic awareness, phonics, decoding, reading comprehension, vocabulary. What specifically about reading is it? Again, on the CUME file check, yes, student is an EL, multilingual learner, English language learner. Well, what's part of their tier 1? Comprehensive ELD. Do they have that access to that core instruction in ELD, comprehensive ELD? What does it look like? Do we have data? Again, what's important? The conversation. And that conversation yields actionable next steps. Always moving beyond the awareness. Yes? Okay, so so for those of you on Zoom that maybe didn't understand or hear the question is, what happens now in a situation where a parent is requesting special education assessment? So, like all things special education, it depends. And we have to get comfortable in the gray, right? However, if the parent request comes and there is some intervention data already that indicates that that might be an area of need, then absolutely, right? Because we already have some intervention data that says that there might be some delays, et cetera, absolutely. But at the end of the day, it has to be investigated. If the parent is requesting that the assessment piece and there is truth and validity to that, absolutely. And I don't know, Debbie, if you want to add anything else to that. So that way everybody in Zoom can hear it. No, it's okay, you're good.
Yes. I think it's very important to always remember and recognize that this is an individualized process. The requirements of IDEA, I guess I should come over here. It's important to always remember that the requirements of IDEA, once a parent requests a referral comes in, then the district has to act accordingly. The school site must act accordingly. It is the team's determination to, at that point, demonstrate a body of evidence if it is in fact that a prior written notice is necessary to indicate that assessment is not warranted or necessary. But for the most part, I think most schools are going to follow through with an assessment when it's requested, given the information and the details. It's in the responsibility of the assessment team, and we'll talk a little bit more about this after lunch. What we hope to garner and share and impart is the fact that how important it is to have data and to ensure that when we do in fact refer a student for special education supports and services, that we understand the why. What is this actual suspected disability? And the same is true when a referral comes in from a parent. To have that conversation and engage parents and guardians in that conversation about what is the suspected disability? Where are the necessary supports? Because in as much as we can refer for special education, we have that 15-day window to provide that assessment plan. We want the assessment plan to be true and respectful of the student and all the assessments that are warranted. But in addition, we continue to provide interventions during that process because we have then 60 days from time of consent to move forward. So it truly is an individual process, but it should be based in data, not on the fact that the student is an English learner, because again, that in and of itself is not one of the disability categories, being an English learner. If anything, we'd want to rule that out, that we've met all the students' needs as a multilingual learner, that they receive the interventions and supports. And tier one, right? What does tier one look like for that multilingual learner? Comprehensive ELD, that the student has truly received the support through, again, designated ELD that takes into account those ELD standards and those interventions. And that may be a deeper conversation where parents maybe are not aware, families, guardians may not be aware of the type of support that's been provided or maybe not yet provided. So lots of things to think about, but I know there's lots of questions in the chat. There is no, must be 3 SST meetings or 4 SST meetings or wait until they're a certain grade or not. It's really about the discussion. There are no requirements like that. It's about the individual child and working as a team to provide all the necessary supports through tiers of intervention, because again, special education is outside of those tiers, focused on the needs as a result from the disability. So that really is the question of the team, is that there may be gaps in learning, as especially coming out of the pandemic, there are many students with gaps in learning, and we know that. But that again is not a disability per se. And again, we'll speak more to that this afternoon. So thank you for the question. I'm not going to go too farther because we still have a lot of stuff to share. But do know it's an individualized process all the way from student study team to referral and of course assessment. So thanks for the question. Oh, there's another question. Sure.
No, I just to address your question. In my experience, I was in San Diego for 10 years and I was part of the student study team as the special ed teacher. We always had a meeting. We had a lot of just letters coming in, and we had a SST chair, so we always met. We met on Fridays. We have this a request from a parent for evaluation, and we'd always meet because a lot of times the parent had concerns, and maybe they heard it from somebody just request an evaluation because they weren't sure where to start. So once we had the meeting, then we would like, oh, these are your concerns. Let's start with some interventions. So we wouldn't just be like, oh, we have a request for an evaluation. Let's start. No, we would always just meet and discuss. Half of the time, it was other concerns that the parent had and just didn't know where to start. So for us, it was like we have to meet and discuss the concerns. Why is the parent requesting that? So that was, but we had an IP, an SST chair. So we knew who the team was, and we had very specific process and steps to follow, and it worked very well. So that is.
Thank you, Alejandra, because we do have that 15-day leeway time from the receipt of that referral to then deciding on an assessment plan. But the meeting is necessary because what is the area of suspected disability? How do we know what we're assessing for? And you can say, I want a referral for special education, but it's our responsibility to disentangle that. What's the true need? Where are the gaps in learning? What's being provided? But ultimately, it's that. What is the area of suspected disability that we're going to assess for? Thank you.
And those are great segues, everybody, and to tie it all together. So let me go back really quickly, and don't worry, I'm keeping track of time. I will give you your break at 9:30. When we are looking at the pre-referral process as a whole, parents are at the core. They're part of that multidisciplinary team. And what Alejandra pointed to is critical communication, clarity on the process, clarity on the roles. Again, this is meant to be a reflective conversation that doesn't take us to a place of like, oh, we should be doing this, or oh, we shouldn't be doing that. It's more about, okay, this is what's the process now. How do we fine tune it? How do we tweak it? How do we add that step? Because in the example that was shared, that site had a clearly established team that had a schedule. Every Friday they met, and there was time to address those concerns. That's one model, one example. If you have others, those of you that are joining us in Zoom, go ahead and share those in the chat. What does your process look like? Are you a part of that process? What are some areas that perhaps you think might require a deeper look at? Because that is definitely going to help shape or determine to some extent how effective our process is. So when we're looking at this intervention summary, again, a great tool for those conversations. Showing up with this document to either be filled out at the meeting or previously filled out, whatever it is, the determination of the team is going to be supportive of that discussion. Once we've collected extrinsic data, CUME file data, intervention data, are perhaps the needs the student is demonstrating related to a language difference or a disability? Are we there? Are we stuck in that, like, I don't know, they've only been here for 2 years and maybe it's an English thing. Maybe once they learn English, they'll get it. Or is it, you know what, they've been here since kinder and they're making progress on the LPAC, and then they're still just not being able to demonstrate growth in academic areas. Like, what is it? It could look a variety of ways. That's why data, intervention data, is so important. And the way this page is structured, and we really must give thanks where thanks are due here. This document was developed by some of our friends as part of the SEP-EL from San Diego Unified School District. And it's structured in a way that gives you the intervention data and what the outcomes were, inclusive of dates. And when we're talking about intervention data, we also want to make sure that we are truly respecting those trials, right? How long has that intervention been tried? How many days? How many minutes? Is it on Mondays when there's perhaps holidays or assemblies? Is it Monday through Friday? Is it when there's a sub? What does that look like? What do those interventions look like, and what does the data collection look like? With that, it is 9:30. I just gave you a lot of information, and I want to give you some time to process. So let's meet back at 9:40, and we'll continue the conversation on all things pre-referral. See you in a bit. And thank you for your engagement, every single one of you here in person. If you have any questions, feel free to ask your questions. If you are a little mic shy, it's okay, we won't hand you the mic. And you can ask your questions, okay? And those of you joining us on Zoom, please do use the Q&A feature to ask your questions. That way it's easier for you to access the answers and for us to ensure that we are addressing your questions. So again, we love it when you share thoughts and comments on the chat, but if you have specific questions, we ask that you use the Q&A feature so we can better monitor those. And using that as a segue, again, just want to reiterate the fact that there is no set number of how many SSTs we need to have prior to an assessment plan being developed, prior to additional referral. Again, there's no legal mandate linked to that. However, again, we always defer back to your school districts, check with your SST chairs for all of the particulars that are more related to local practice. So we left off on this form, Appendix 3.4. Appendix 3.4, again, readily available for you to download, save locally, fill out, print to help develop your electronic files. This resource available to you and anyone you'd like to share it with. Okay, so now let's put it all together. Let's look at it visually. Junior high, I hated flowcharts. Now as an adult, I appreciate a good flowchart. It keeps me organized and I know what I'm doing. Appendix 3.5 is the English learner initial referral and decision-making process. Again, great resource available for you as a download that supports pre-referral activities. Looking at this flow chart, you are able to start from the top, read through, and make a decision, whether yes or no. Question, reflection, determination. Next. Question, reflection, determination. Next. So on and so forth. This is an absolutely great resource that you can print as is, make it branded with more specifics related to your site that can be printed and laminated and kept as part of your processes. These questions are meant to prompt reflection and discussion. Question 1, for example, asks about physical or psychological factors being ruled out as primary considerations. Well, how do I know that? Oh, there's a resource for that, and that is this appendix. 3.3 helped you consider extrinsic factors. Now you have a means of engaging in this question. How do personal and cultural factors figure here? Have they been ruled out as primary contributors of the disabilities? Again, extrinsic factors page. All of these resources are linked together to help your flow. As you're looking at the resources we've shared up to this point, it might be that you already have something like this at your site. And that is fantastic. Like I said earlier, this is meant to help prompt reflection. And reflection doesn't always take us to, oh no, immediate overhaul needed. It might be very much a situation where we're like, great, we're doing it right. Or, I need some tweaks. Or, I'm missing this chunk. Again, resources for you to consider and take back to your teams as we are ensuring appropriate referral processes, pre-referral activities to address what? Over or under identification. If the student needs the support, meets eligibility criteria, they should absolutely receive it. If they need comprehensive ELD, it's a different story. So again, points for us to consider. Now, question for the group, Zoom and in person. Is it advisable to group ELs with non-ELs for intervention? Use the chat feature to share your response. Tell your partner. Talk about it. Think about it. And this question is part of the frequently asked questions that are contained in each chapter. So each chapter has a section that addresses frequently asked questions, and this is pulled from there. If you click on that link, it'll take you to the listing. Don't click on there to see the answer. Just know that that link is there for you to view all FAQs related to chapter 3. All right. And survey says, yes. English learners may benefit from being around non-English learners and with English-speaking peers with similar learning needs. That's a caveat. Similar learning needs. However, incredibly, incredibly important that they are progress monitored separately from their English-only peers and compared to like peers to determine if appropriate levels of progress are being made. Take into consideration the English language proficiency of the student when grouping for instructions. So again, yes, absolutely, they may benefit from English-only peers and and English learners as well. However, we want to make sure that it is with similar learning needs and that when we're comparing, it's to like peers, meaning English learner to English learner, but even more nuanced than that, similar ELP, English language proficiency. And I would even say you would want to look a little deeper at listening, speaking, reading, writing than just the overall. So again, coming back to our wheel, referral made by staff, parent, guardian, identification, and now we are here. Pre-referral activities and interventions, number 3. We have now started progress monitoring. We're using data-based intentional teaching that is culturally and linguistically responsive. And we are establishing 4 to 6 week trials. Consistent 4 to 6 week trials. Look at the data generated. You analyze the intervention. Is it done with fidelity? Is there still differentiation in asset building? 4 to 6 week trials. Are we making adjustments to the interventions? And or referring for further assessment because it might be appropriate that the data indicates that, you know what, there is a need here. We want to review the provision of core services, which is inclusive of comprehensive ELD, designated and integrated, both, not or, both, and ongoing review of accessibility tools. What are we providing the student to be able to access content and demonstrate growth, development, and or mastery? We've given you quite a bit of information at this point. And you've had some time to stop and think about your current processes. What are those documented pre-referral processes? Can we articulate them? If we can't, do we know where to find them? If we don't, who might we ask? What are those currently written and unwritten? If a document exists, do our processes match what we actually do in quote unquote real life? Are the tools that we use to progress monitor appropriate for English learners? How do we know? When we are comparing growth, is it to like peers? Might these assessment tools or data collection tools or interventions, might they contain a language bias that may be affecting the data? Yes, no, I don't know. Let me ask someone. Again, questions for us to pause, process, all related to the pre-referral process, the tools available, and the resources as well. Go ahead and use the chat box to share with us what these reflective questions prompted for you. It could be on you as an individual. I need to find out more about blank. It might be as part of your SST team. As a member of the SST team, I want to share X, Y, and Z. What is this prompting within? I'm going to go ahead and give you a minute or two to enter your response in the chat. And for you live participants, share with a partner what have some of these questions prompted, whether it relates to personal next steps or collective next steps. Go ahead and take 2 minutes and go. All right, everybody. Thank you so much for your engagement. We really appreciate it. So, live folks, anybody feeling brave enough to share what some of those questions prompted? Or maybe Debbie, Lupita, Christina, if you want to read maybe a reflection that somebody shared.
I can share about like
okay.
biases.
Mm-hmm.
There's always going to be language biases. I mean, not just for EL students, but even just native English speakers. Because I mean, it can be regional. Because we were kind of joking about like chocolates,
Right.
But like a student don't know what chocolate, but I mean, they can be called a slipper or a flip flop or just a flippy or
right.
A sandal.
Right.
So many different names mean the same thing. So, just in language itself, when you're using that particular vocabulary, there could be, multiple synonyms for a word.
Mm-hmm.
But the student's not going to understand.
Yes.
Kind of even expect native English speakers to know every synonym is kind of biased.
Right. Language is alive, right? And language is impacted by many things like regional. So for those of you in Zoom, what was shared was in relation to language biases. Oh, so we're going to make you repeat your question.
okay.
Sorry, Bobby.
I'm sorry. We were talking about language biases and how they can even be regional. For instance, it's chancla here for there's always the joke about the secret of la chancla. But that could be considered, in English, like a flippy, a flip-flop, a sandal. I forgot the other names, but there are multiple synonyms just for that word in particular. So to expect an EL student, even a native speaker, to have that, is not really that great. Like even when I was administering, this goes back years ago to the WJ3,
Mm-hmm.
They sat there and they talked about tape players. I don't know if you remember, there was a thing about a tape player.
I remember.
And I actually had to explain, what a tape player was, because students are used to like iPods, MP3 players. So when you say tape player, they're just like, what? So,
Right.
yeah, there's pretty much language bias, I believe, in just everything.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that, because also as we start thinking about, when I talked earlier about reading, right? And how one of those components is vocabulary, that is definitely going to impact your reading comprehension if you don't have certain vocabulary. And that's in relation to language as well. And if we remember back to our domains for English language development, it's listening, speaking, reading, and writing. And they're all related. They're all linked. So one is definitely going to feed the other. So absolutely critical for us to be aware of language biases that might increase a bias. Call it out more in a way, highlight it, and have it affect the data that we are collecting. With that, I shall pass it on to my peer, Lupita, to take it on now. Baton
Thanks,
passed.
Vanessa. Just doing a sound. Can I hand this to you? Sure. Just doing a quick sound check. My voice is a little bit softer, so just kind of raise your hand or let me know if you can't quite hear me. I'll try to project as much as possible. So I just want to piggyback a little bit on your comment regarding language biases, and there's also cultural biases. And you gave a really excellent example that will age some of us, right? Where some of these terms that are familiar to, that are generational, let's just call them generational, but they're also regional, may no longer be used, or to some degree, we probably have no use for them any longer, right? So those are things that we want to consider when we are thinking and talking about English language development and English language acquisition. We want to take a closer look at what does that look like, what language do students know, what language do they bring to the table, and how does that relate to not only their language acquisition progress, but their academic progress as well. And we'll circle back to ELD in just a little bit. So Vanessa joked a little bit about how she disliked infographics when she was a kid. Well, guess what? She loves them now. And so do we. We really take pride in being able to take many of the resources that are found in our practitioner's guide, and we try to synthesize and repackage them in such a way that they work as a companion to some of the resources and information that's in the very hefty practitioner's guide, so that it's a little bit more usable for practitioners. So on that note, we have this pre-referral flowchart that basically compiles all of the resources that Vanessa shared with you today, all of those appendices that she walked you through today. And so they are embedded in this one infographic with other resources as well. But they're embedded in this one infographic. And the purpose of this infographic is to give you a resource, a tool that you can use in your multidisciplinary team or individually, depending on what your role is, to be able to walk you through in a more systematic way, addressing some of the key components that we ought to take into consideration as we're beginning to think about and discuss a possible referral for special education assessment. So I'm going to walk you through the four components in this infographic, and I want you to think about what Vanessa walked you through earlier today as your background knowledge. So be thinking about those resources in relationship to these four components. So the first component in the infographic involves taking into consideration a whole child approach. Yes, academics are absolutely critical and important, and that's really why that's why we're in the business of education, right? We want to make sure that students have academic success. However, when we're taking into consideration the possibility of a referral for an English learner, we need to take some additional steps and considerations for those linguistic needs that the English learner has. So linguistic needs and personal needs. In this case, we want to take a look at not only the CUME file, to take a kind of a look at the educational history of the student that we're considering. What did attendance look like? What artifacts of student progress exist in the CUME file? What does that look like? Laying it all out and taking a look at it through our respective lenses, considering that you do have a multidisciplinary team, an EL lead, a general ed person, a SPED person, an administrator, any other type of support staff that may be part of the multidisciplinary team. Taking a look at that type of information, student data as a team, and bringing in your respective lens is going to paint a more deeper, more comprehensive picture of what the student is able to do. So a deeper dive and a more comprehensive view of the CUME file is critical, right? All eyes on deck. You've heard the term all hands on deck. In this case, we really want these different lenses to take a look at this data and be able to share and contribute another level of what that CUME file may contain. Also, we want to take into consideration some psychological factors that may impact learning or present as a barrier for learning. Might there have been some trauma, maybe a recent death, right? Or some probably some personal, health issues. Is there a current medical condition that we don't know of? Maybe there's a screening for vision and auditory. So we really need to take a deeper dive into the CUME file and also inquire about these other types of factors that may impact learning. And again, this section of the infographic will link you to resources that Vanessa walked you through, as well as other resources. When you get through this section of the infographic and the determination is made that these other factors perhaps have an impact on learning and are probably the reason why the student is having difficulty, then we need to stop and really have the conversation about other types of resources that the student may need, perhaps some additional resources in counseling or pointing the family in the direction of some health services. So again, it's kind of a stop and check, and that's what you see in that white section with the little hand and the light bulb on the hand. That's a kind of stop and check, right? So if after gathering this information, we begin leaning more towards perhaps it's not a true learning disability, rather these other factors that are impacting learning, then we absolutely continue with having a dialogue about what other supports might the student need that are not related to assessment for potential, for a possible disability. The next section of the infographic earlier today, we talked about how important it is for parents to be able, or guardians to be able to contribute information. So that's what this section of the practitioner, I keep saying practitioner's guide, of the infographic gives us. So here we want to, again, pause and check to see what other information, personal information, do we need that may not exist. And this is where communication with families and guardians is absolutely instrumental to contribute to what are some of the patterns of behavior, of language use, of study skills that they see at home. And so that information, again, is critical so that we can compare or cross-reference with what the observations are in the school setting. Other considerations involve cultural factors. Is it an immigrant family? Was there an issue of perhaps there's a separation of family? Maybe it's an immigrant family and parents are still living at home country, right? And so there's this issue of, I miss my family, I miss my friends. All of these things have impact on learning. So again, it's important for us to go through these components, gather as much information as possible. And in this section, it's absolutely critical that we reach out to the families and guardians and have a conversation and gather as much information as possible to add to this student profile that we're creating. And again, if at this point we may begin to have the determination that, this is an issue of a personal cultural factor that is really holding the child back from progressing, then we do a pause, stop, and start now talking about what additional resources might we be able to offer to support and address these factors that have nothing to do with the disability, but still the child and family may need to continue to succeed. The next component is language development. There were a few questions in the chat and probably some lingering questions in your head, and a couple of them have been expressed regarding language development. So language development for an English learner is absolutely critical in order for him or her to be successful academically and socially. So what we want to take into consideration here is ensuring that English language development is happening consistently and effectively. And what that means is that the ELD standards are at the core of comprehensive ELD. And just as a reminder, comprehensive ELD in the state of California is comprised of two types of English language instruction: designated ELD and integrated ELD. So it's not either or, it's both. For as long as a student is identified as an English learner with or without an IEP, that student must receive comprehensive ELD all the way up until the point that the student is reclassified from English learner status. So at this point, we want to stop and have a hard conversation about what does comprehensive ELD look like for this student. Has it been consistent? Is it aligned to the ELD standards? Have we identified the language proficiency level, and are we using that information to scaffold and provide supports for the English learner? Are they using the language that they are learning in an authentic way? And if we're not sure, then that's where we kind of lean into either maybe there's a training available for teachers, maybe they need more training, or maybe they need more support in designing lessons. And so our attention moves to what do we need to do to bolster comprehensive ELD so that this child and all other English learners are receiving high quality language development instruction rather than moving towards assessment because the student isn't progressing. So we really need to have that hard conversation and ask ourselves and ask those that can provide us with that information, what does comprehensive ELD look like for this child? What information do we have about its effectiveness? How is it aligned to the ELD standards? And might there be a need for additional training and support for anyone who is working with this child? The fourth component involves learning environments and using the appropriate supports. Now, I want to go back to this notion of providing tiers of support and instruction. So as Debbie mentioned earlier today, and we did talk about it a little bit more in depth in our Section 1 training, that special education is outside of the tiers of instruction and support, outside of tiers 1, 2, and 3. However, comprehensive ELD is not. Comprehensive ELD is not an intervention for English learners. Comprehensive ELD is Tier 1 instruction. And because it is Tier 1 instruction, we want to make sure that we are targeting the ELD standards to design our lessons, and that we have identified language proficiency levels. If we're not doing those things, then we are we're not doing what our students need, right? They absolutely need quality instruction. They absolutely need to have this type of support in language development so that they can access the content. So our learning environments have to be culturally responsive. They have to be linguistically responsive for our EL students. They have to be respectful. They have to be inclusive. They have to be welcoming, right? We want to have all of our students feel that they have something to contribute and that they can and will learn. And so they're going to feed off of how we welcome them, how we design our lessons, and how we deliver our lessons. So our learning environments are absolutely critical. Our context for learning is the first step in helping all of us as learners feel that we can contribute and that we can take our learning, our skills, our content to the next level. There's a bottom section of the infographic for two very important reminders. One of them is what we're going to dive into a little bit deeper, and that's assessment. But in this case, this reminder has to do with the role of primary language in assessment. In order for us to be able to gather the most current and appropriate information about what the student is able to do, we want to take into consideration the student's primary language and what they're able to show. Where might they be able to best demonstrate and show what they know? And so we don't want to rule out that perhaps we may need to assess in the primary language to be able to access that type of information. And Debbie and Christina are going to dive a little bit deeper into the topic of assessment later on today. And the other reminder is, again, comprehensive ELD. I cannot stress enough how critical it is for us to, number one, number two, and number three, make sure that comprehensive ELD is consistent, is effective, and aligned to the ELD standards. And if teachers need extra training and support, then we absolutely must offer it. It is part of core instruction for all English learners, and it's the gateway to help them access content across the curriculum. So these are the two very critical reminders that we want to be able to keep in our back pocket as we begin to have conversations about pre-referral for our English learners. So I shared with you one infographic that is chock full of additional resources. So what we want to be able to do next is to give you a little bit of time to process that information by having you explore the different resources that are going to help you refine, reflect, and perhaps make some necessary tweaks and changes to your current pre-referral process. So we're going to put about 7 minutes on the clock to give you some time to explore these resources. There's one new resource on this slide, and that's the note-taking guide. The note-taking guide, if you access the note-taking guide, it will also have all of the resources linked on the guide so that you don't have to go back and forth from slide to resource. So what you're going to do in the next few minutes is give yourself the gift of time to explore a couple of the resources that you see on the slide, which can also be found in the note-taking guide, and jot some notes down for where might I be able to use these. What might I need to include or add? How might this resource better inform our process so that we're able to gather more information, more comprehensive information about our students to make an appropriate referral. So with that, we're going to put 7 minutes on the clock. We'll give you a little bit of time to explore. And for those of you on Zoom, if you have any questions or statements about wonderings or things that I learned, you can jot it down in the chat. And those of you that are here in person with us, feel free to share with us live. So 7 minutes on the clock. See you back in a few. To become familiar with the note-taking guide, as well as the resources that we've introduced and walked you through up until this point. We encourage you to take advantage of these resources, including the pre-referral flowchart, which contains all of these resources, to help you engage in a dialogue, not only about your pre-referral process, but also how to create a system that will better inform the multidisciplinary team and in making the best informed decision to determine whether or not it is necessary for a student to receive special education services. So on that note, we're going to move into another topic that was touched upon up until this point. And this is really taking into consideration when we come across an English learner whom we think is manifesting learning behaviors that we are thinking might be a disability. And one of the components that we want to ensure that we are familiar with and know how to address and move through is understanding the different behaviors that can manifest when students are learning a second language, and also when it may be a disability. So what are the commonalities between in behaviors and indicators between language difference and disability? And so that's the piece that we're going to move into next. So again, this question that you see posed on this slide is a critical question that we need to ask ourselves within the multidisciplinary team. Have we carefully reviewed and discussed the comparisons that exist between language difference versus disability? And are we able to discern them to determine whether this is behaviors that an English learner typically demonstrate as he or she is learning a second language compared to, no, these are indicators of a possible disability. So how do we do that? How do we have that conversation when we may have limited or no understanding of second language acquisition. Again, this is why it's absolutely critical to have your EL lead, your EL TOSA, a person who is trained and has experience and expertise in second language acquisition. That person should be at the table at the very least to inform this type of discussion. So we're going to introduce a resource. Oops, let me go back. Before we introduce the resource, I'm going to share a short video clip that's going to talk about this very important content, language difference versus disability. I want to ask that you consider this purpose for viewing. As you are listening and viewing this video clip, be thinking about and listening for practices that are familiar to you, practices that you may have seen or used during the pre-referral process to address language difference versus disability. Also, take note of some practices that may not be familiar to you or that you don't see during your pre-referral process. And take note of those and be thinking about how might those be incorporated into your current practices. So we're going to roll the clip, and then when we come back, we'll have a brief debrief on what you see, what things are triggering in your mind about what might be necessary. And then I'm going to introduce a tool to help us have at least be able to have a dialogue around the table about language difference and disability. Can you roll the clip, please? So as we're preparing the video, oh, it's up here. Sorry about that. As you're viewing the video clip, feel free to drop in the chat what's familiar to you and what are some of the considerations that you see in here that you want to start implementing in your current practices.
Is to really have a pretty helpful.
Okay, here we go. Let's try this again.
Generally, a lot of us have questions regarding, is this a language difference, or is this language development, or second language development, or is it disability? And part of it, regardless what our various disciplines are, is to really have a pretty healthy depth of understanding around what types of predictable programming can students count on that's going to be effective, that's going to be successful? How do we really plan for working with the complex, diverse differences of students? And then how do we look for what's working and how can we make it work better? And when that occurs, we're much more sure that our programming is optimal. And there are a variety of different ways to measure that, both from what are we doing to help build relationships with students, help them feel like they're active trusted members of their classrooms, what kinds of just sociocultural things can we do to build strong relationships with our students and their families. When we engage students in paired and group work, how are we basing that on creating those strong collaborative partnerships with students? How much attention are we paying to issues of second language acquisition in terms of sort of the developmental process of acquiring a new language? And every state has standards regarding their students, English learners, level of English language development, and how much are we targeting instruction to each student's specific level of language and literacy development. So that's an important element. When it comes to the academic or subject matter, how are we sure that we're providing an instructional program that's based on our students' prior learning, and we can build from that, and that's using materials that are appropriate for our students? And then lastly, how are we really ensuring that we're helping students think about what we're teaching and helping them learn to do that? So part of it is really thinking about learning as a four-prong process, regardless of who our students are and where they're coming from. First, how are we building connections with their personal, cultural, world and language knowledge? Second, how are we paying attention to their level of language and literacy development? Third, how are we paying attention to their prior schooling or prior knowledge in the subject matter we're teaching. And then 4, in what ways are we helping students sort of think to learn? What does that look like? And what should instructional conversations look like based on our students' level of literacy? And when we do that, we have a wonderful chance of helping students be more successful. And then when that's layered with, if we more properly identify students with disabilities and provide an educational program that really helps provide interventions that are found to be effective, we can do many wonderful things with all English learners.
So as you're processing the information that we heard through the video clip, at least what stands out for me is how important it is to have systems in place that support both language acquisition, designated ELD, and access to content, integrated ELD, for all of our English learners prior to consideration for a referral. We want to ensure that those instructional systems and supports and resources are used and afforded to all of our English learners before we start talking about a disability. So again, there may be students that do have a disability who are also English learners, and that's who we're talking about today. And we're still not sure, how do we untangle that? How do we make sure that we're not over-identifying, right? But also under-identifying. Oh, it's just a language acquisition. We're gonna let him or her be, let them learn English a little bit longer. We don't wanna go that route either, because then we're not providing the necessary supports that those children may need. So for that, I wanna share with you a resource that can be found in the practitioner's guide.
Generally, a lot of us have questions.
Here we go. I don't know why I wasn't clicking. There we go. So this is figure 3.3. You can find it in your Padlet. You can also access it via this slide if you just click on the title. And what this resource helps us do is it helps us think through different indicators or behaviors in learning that English learners may have, and it helps us kind of untangle that. What does it look like for an English learner, and what does it look like for a student who may have a disability in 9 different areas? So what we want to be able to afford you is, again, the gift of time to become familiar with this resource, to help establish at least some common understanding, some common ground on how do we begin to have that conversation and be able to prepare ourselves to ask this question when we're at the table, or ask this question of ourselves. So let's do this, folks. I've been reminded that it's time for a break. We want to give you a brain break and a little bit of processing time. So what I would like to have you do is take a quick stretch, 10-minute, okay? 10-minute stretch break. When we come back, we're going to dig into this resource. So why don't we do that? 10-minute stretch break, come back, we'll recap, and we'll give you some time to explore. And we're back. Hopefully you had a little bit of time to stretch your legs, grab another cup of coffee, hydrate yourself, take care of you. So the next component of this section of our presentation involves introducing and becoming familiar with a resource that can be found in the practitioner's guide, and that is figure 3.3. For those of you in Zoom, you can find all of the resources that we've shared with you up until this point under the Chapter 3 column of your Padlet. You may need to scroll to the right a little bit to access it. We've organized the Padlet in such a way that it's organized by chapter, and every section, every day, we have about 2 chapters per section. So for this resource and all of the resources Vanessa shared with you up until this point, all of those resources can be found in the slide deck as well as in the Chapter 3 column of your Padlet. So back to figure 3.3. Figure 3.3 is a table comprised of 9 additional tables that identify different academic, behavior, and language components. Within these 9 tables, you're going to see information to help you, again, establish some common understanding and prepare you to have a discussion and ask questions, further questions about whether the student may be presenting behaviors or indicators of a language difference, that is learning English as a second language, or is it indeed a disability? So what we would like for you to do is to spend, again, some time becoming familiar with this resource. Become familiar with it, identify how it's organized, and then as you're becoming familiar with it, we ask that you think about these 3 questions on the slide. What are your learnings and wonderings? What weren't you aware of? What's new information for you regarding this topic of language difference versus disability? What other questions does it trigger? Because I do want to state that although this is a very good resource, it's not exhaustive. It's, again, think of it as a starter to be able to have a conversation specifically around this topic, language difference versus disability. So what are your learnings? What are your wonderings? How might you use this resource? Might you use it as a part of professional development for your staff, for your multidisciplinary team? And who do you think needs to be aware of it? Who might you want to share it with? Again, these 3 questions, be thinking about them as you explore and become familiar with the resource. So on that note, I think we want to give you, how much time do we have, ladies? 15 or 20 minutes? Give me 15 minutes. We'll give you about 15 minutes to become familiar with the resource. Again, you can access it through this slide. Just click on the figure 3.3 jigsaw. Or you can access it on the Padlet towards the bottom of the chapter 3 column. And with that, we're going to put 15 minutes on the clock. See you back in 15. I hope that this time was sufficient, at least for you to become familiar with the resource itself. And then again, you would have noticed that we reorganized the resource in such a way that can be used to help support perhaps some training or professional development around this topic. And again, use the resource itself, figure 3.3 as you find it in the practitioner's guide, or the figure 3.3 jigsaw that is linked to this slide. In any way that you deem appropriate, again, to deepen our staff, our practitioners, our multidisciplinary teams' understanding on some indicators and behaviors that students may manifest, and to help us discern and help make a better decision based on language difference compared to a disability. So on that note, I want you to think about these 2 questions. Again, kind of our grounding questions. Why is it so critical that we are familiar with second language acquisition behaviors, as well as how might they manifest for an English learner who may have a disability, and what might be some commonalities between the 2. And so these 2, I would like to leave you with these 2 questions to be thinking about and reflecting upon in your respective roles. So how does the team review and discuss comparisons between a language difference versus a disability? And what curriculum-based assessments and observations are used to determine whether indeed it's a difference compared to a disability? What information do we have, or can we gather, or can we ask for to help us make a better determination of between the 2? So on that note, I want to reintroduce Cruzita, little Cruz. If you're with us in section 1, we introduced Cruz as a student who was a young, I think she was in kindergarten. At this point, Cruz is a 2nd grader. And what we know about Cruz at this point is that she continues to struggle with reading skills, and we have implemented some interventions, but to no avail. So what I would like to give you, again, a little tinier gift of time, is to further explore this phase in Cruz's progress, or lack thereof in this case, so that we can kind of put everything together. This section of the student scenario indeed puts all of the pieces that we've shared with you up to this point into a very concrete example in the student scenario. So again, it's just a short section of Cruz's trajectory in her learning and her experiences and behaviors in her learning. So I would like to again give you about 5 minutes. It's very short. 5 minutes to reintroduce yourself to Cruz and be thinking about all the content and the resources we've shared up with you up to this point, and see how they may fit into this phase of Cruz's learning trajectory. Again, we're going to put 5 minutes on the clock, refamiliarize yourself with Cruz, and again, jot down, drop in the chat any learnings or wonderings that you may have up to this point. And again, our final 5 minutes on the clock. See you back in 5. All right, folks. Thank you for engaging and using this gift of time to become more familiar with the range of resources that can be found in the practitioner's guide. The student scenarios are all housed in the practitioner's guide. When we put them together for these presentations, depending on how we want you to explore, what content we want you to further dive into, we repackage them or reorganize them or create a companion resource such as our infographics. But all of the resources that we've shared with you up to this point can be found in the practitioner's guide. So the varied links that are afforded to you through the slide deck and in the Padlet, again, all of the resources can be found and can take you directly to the document itself, as well as our website. If you haven't visited our website yet, we do have a landing page that's specifically devoted to the California Practitioner's Guide, where we've taken all of the figures, all of the appendices, and different sections of the Practitioner's Guide that can be more easily accessed by users. So if you haven't visited us yet, I highly encourage you to do so, specifically our landing page for the California Practitioner's Guide. So on that note, I want to give you some time to share your insights, to perhaps share some of your wonderings that you may have having to do with the student scenario or any aspect of what we've shared with you up to this point. Please feel free to drop it in the chat. And also, I want to take note that it is just about getting ready for us to take a break for lunch. I want to hand it over to Dr. Deborah Montoya very quickly to give us some instructions for lunch, as well as some insights as to what we're going to be doing this afternoon. And I'm handing it off.
Thank you, Lupita. And we love to hear from you. So please do add your new learnings and wonderings into the chat box. And of course, our live members, we're more than happy to discuss with you any new learnings and wonderings that you might have. The scenario from Cruz really is an exemplar, if you will, to help your teams reflect and consider what does your pre-referral process look like now? Where are there perhaps some gaps or missing team members? There was a robust discussion about having your EL specialists, and they were different titles. It may be an EL coordinator, an EL specialist, maybe it's a teacher on special assignment, who again has some knowledge and understanding regarding second language acquisition skills, language development skills. As you work to decipher, is this truly a language difference for then which we can employ and utilize additional interventions and supports to help students gain needed English language acquisition skills? Or does it appear to be more than the needs of an English learner, but rather perhaps a suspected disability in any of those domain areas? The more concise we can get that data, it also puts us on a better footing to then be able to say, this is the area of suspected disability for which then we are going to shape our assessment plan and then move forward with comprehensive, valid, and reliable assessments. And that's where we're going to go next. After lunch, we will take a deeper dive into the California Practitioner's Guide for Educating English Learners with Disabilities in Chapter 4. All of the links to Chapter 4 are found in the Chapter 4 column of your Padlet. If you scroll off to the right, you'll find there then the Chapter 4 with, again, access to the entire chapter, but however, we'll give you the highlights. So this particular chapter does review all the components regarding assessment. So in that space where the student study team, student success team finds that perhaps it's more than, there are concerns that seem to be beyond the needs of a multilingual learner. And there's again data that's telling us it's perhaps more than just a gap in learning, where there are concerns regarding the student, how the student integrates, uses, accesses information, and may need additional supports. Because as we know, should a student be eligible for special education under one of those 13 disability categories, special education is a service. Supports and service, not necessarily a place. And that's also important information for our student study teams to know as well, because that may just mean that as a team, we talk about, again, tiers of intervention and support that the student may need, as we have students who are dually identified learners, students who are multilingual learners who have, in fact, a disability, where there's needs for additional supports in tier 2, in tier 3, in addition to special education, which is outside and above and beyond those tiers of intervention. So as we look through chapter 4, you do have an infographic. If you see the infographic on your slide, it is downloadable and usable. You can download it as blocks, just as all of the other chapters, as this may be another resource that you take to your assessment teams, have discussions with your school psychologist, your speech and language pathologist, all those who make your assessment team given that area of suspected disability. So this can provide you with a short entry point, some quick tools and tips, in addition to lots of hyperlinks to all of the state and federal mandates. So if you're participating as a teacher or service provider, I like to use service provider because it's just a broader category. When we come back from lunch, we will be reviewing what are the requirements to ensure that we're conducting a valid and reliable comprehensive assessment for potential, and I say potential, special education eligibility of a multilingual learner who has been referred for such assessment. What role does we take, and how do we identify, again, the needs of English learner students? What data do we use to inform the assessment process? So all the way from the selection of the assessment tools to the actual use of those tools and considerations that we may take as assessor. And I often say we in this chapter because I myself many moons ago was a school psychologist. So this is definitely in my wheelhouse. So you'll be hearing from Christina and myself this afternoon, who again, our practice is school psychology. And then our role. What role do parents play in the assessment process in ensuring that we have active engagement with our parents and guardians so that we can understand more about what does L1 look like, primary language. And that, again, is something that we want to include in our assessments, again, where possible, and we'll speak to that a little bit more in a bit. But as we think about the assessment process, is also identifying and recognizing that if the student truly has a disability, it will be evident in their primary language. Because as noted before, being a second language learner, so being a multilingual learner in and of itself, is not reason for referral for special education assessment, nor for potential 504. That is not a disability. And then for our administrators, the important things that we look out for as an administrator is what are the state and federal requirements. So in your administrator lens, as we look and sit in those assessment initial IEPs, as we sit in that triennial eligibility evaluation meeting, what are we listening for? What is that area of suspected disability for which the student may require special education related services, and those harder conversations about, is there in fact a disability versus a language difference? So when we come back from lunch, we will go deeper into chapter 4, covering all of those legal requirements that are necessary for assessment processes. So the entire process, not just the report itself, but what does that process look like as we consider the evaluation and the evaluation tools? So with that, we're going to go ahead and take a break for lunch. You'll get exactly 1 hour. Well, I'm cheating you 1 minute because it is 11:31. So we will be back at 12:30, ready to go and get started and take a deeper dive into chapter 4. Thank you again. And if anyone wants to hang back in live to ask any questions, feel free. And then, of course, for our friends in the Zoom room, feel free to enter any questions and or new learnings that you have into the chat box. We love to hear from you. Thanks so much and enjoy your lunch. Welcome back. Hope you had a great lunch. Welcome back, those on Zoom. I hope you had a good lunch. And we're ready to go to jump into chapter 4. So all things regarding evaluation components and ensuring culturally and linguistically sound evaluation tools and assessment practices. So as we jump into the next session, we're going to play a short video regarding assessment just to help ground us and further the conversation. So I'm going to go ahead and play that video now.
When you look at over-identification, you get kind of the opposite face of the problem. In this case, people think that the problem is a disability and they don't consider linguistic or cultural differences or educational opportunity as contributors to the problem. And so they make a referral too quickly. And then you get into some really difficult issues. We don't have the assessment instruments that we need to make an accurate identification of disabilities among students who speak different languages. Even when you have assessment instruments available in Spanish, they may also be culturally and linguistically irrelevant for the student that you're concerned about. So the assessment instruments, you can take almost any student and assess them with the available tools, and they'll qualify because the instruments are inappropriate. Sometimes we make the decision that general education can't serve the needs of the student, particularly because we have populations of students that really have significant learning difficulties. If you look at students with interrupted formal schooling, for example, who come here as adolescents, haven't been in school or have had inconsistent schooling, the gap is so wide that the sentiment is that if you make a special education referral, the student will be with a teacher who has specialized skills, smaller classes, materials designed to close those significant gaps. And so special education can actually become a dumping ground for students who have significant difficulties for reasons other than the presence of a disability. So overrepresentation becomes a huge issue because we haven't been able to overcome what is oftentimes negative expectations associated with a disability. So the student over time does worse because they're not getting the appropriate instruction, because we may not have special education teachers who understand how to support the language and cultural needs of the student. So even though they're in this smaller class, the gap can widen because the instruction is inappropriate. So there are a lot of factors that contribute to overrepresentation. And I think one of the big issues for students is that once we put them in, we seldom let them out. And so we identify students as having disabilities very early, and then they can spend the rest of their school career in a special education program or receiving special education services, even though they don't have a disability.
So lots to think about and consider as we watch that video, and knowing that referrals for special education may sometimes come in droves. And we also recognize that in California, we may have some issues regarding over-identification in as much as maybe some school sites that have under-identification. So over and under-identification is a concern. Those of you participating with us today may also be thinking about your specific school site or school district, your county office and or SELPA. Some of you may be participating today because significant disproportionality is something that has been identified given your respective district. We have heard across California those districts who are maybe looking at the subgroup of Hispanic or another or different culture, ethnicity and group, as well as over-identification in SLD or OHI, and finding that perhaps students who are multilingual learners are being referred in inordinate amounts for special education assessment and services. But let's stick to the data and what we know. So in California, there's this large group of students that fall in specific learning disability. So here you see 47.5%. What does that mean? This number is the number of English learners, multilingual learners, who have been identified in California as having a specific learning disability. So we see that the majority of students who are multilingual learners who are identified as a student with a disability, so dually identified students, as we say, fall into this category of specific learning disability. Trailing behind then there is speech and language impairment, autism, and so forth. So you can see the disability categories there and how multilingual learners are represented in those respective disability categories. We have to make some assumptions that students have been assessed with validity and reliability and comprehensiveness for which you are attending today, to want to identify, are we actually following those parameters? Are we ensuring that students are assessed with cultural and linguistic validity? Because there are questions. If your amount of specific learning disabilities who are English learners, so that dually identified group there, you might be wondering, what percentage is that of your total population of students with disabilities? Who conducts the assessments? Have we ensured that students are provided with assessments that are appropriate given their cultural, linguistic, and backgrounds and needs? So when we think about specific learning disability, I'm going to pick on that disability category for just a little bit because that is, again, the primary suspected disability. So if we think to earlier this morning, talking about pre-referral and referral practices, what are your pre-referral practices? Has the team taken time to consider language difference versus disability prior to that referral? Or is it something that's being done through that referral process if it hasn't been done already? So that might be also a conversation through the assessment process. But it's important for us to know and understand what is a specific learning disability. It's also important for us to share with our general educators, our student study teams, our EL specialists, so that we build common language among special educators and general educators together, that our student study team as a true team has a full understanding of what is an actual specific learning disability, because it's also important to know what it is in as much as what it isn't, so that we understand again what the needs are of students and what it is to actually have a specific learning disability. Because special education then, yes, if the child has a specific learning disability, can target interventions and supports that are specialized. And that's the difference there, that we work to serve the student that has an actual disability. So specific learning disability, you see the definition there on your screen. It is rather long. So what I want us to pay attention to is right in the middle there, you'll see that may have manifested itself in the imperfect ability to, and then you have a list there. Listen, think, speak, read, write, spell, or do mathematical calculations, including such as perceptual disabilities, brain injury, minimal brain dysfunction, dyslexia. That's often a question. Dyslexia is a form of a specific learning disability. It's not its own disability category, but it is a specific learning disability. But as you think there and we talk about imperfect, I always, tell my staff, I don't do anything perfectly. I don't think I do anything 100% of the time. We are naturally made perfectly imperfect. And yet, yes, we will have gaps. We all have relative strengths and weaknesses. So as we discuss specific learning disability, we kind of need to put that in the back of our minds, is that we all have relative strengths and relative weaknesses. We will have students that have gaps in learning. We see that in students with and without disabilities. And that's why it's important to note that this particular disability category has two prongs. So yes, a gap in learning. So children with learning disabilities demonstrate a severe discrepancy or patterns of strengths and weaknesses. And in California, we have the ability to select if you use a patterns of strength and weakness or PSW model, as opposed to severe discrepancy model. That is to your choice. Again, use those choices wisely. But as you look at relative strengths and specifically weaknesses, so now we're talking deficits. Do we have the data available to us through the pre-referral system, referral system, and of course, gathering additional data to be sure that we are specific and unique about each of these categories as we are now in the assessment phase. So at this point, the student has been identified by the student study team, student success team, your team, that says it's more than language difference. We suspect there's a disability. Perhaps it's that parent referral that said, we suspect there's a disability because this is where we see concerns. Well, we want to ensure that we are uniquely assessing these areas to determine, is there in fact a severe or significant pattern of strength and weakness or deficits in any one of these areas. So any one or more of these areas. Maybe there are multiple deficits in these academic skills. But the second part is what we need to assure that our teams are aware of. It's the why. Why do we have those gaps in learning? Why does this child struggle so much in these specific academic areas? because of this. We need to be able to directly relate that deficit, that gap in learning, to a processing disorder in one or more of the following areas, and you see them listed there. Attention, visual processing, auditory processing, phonological processing, sensory motor skills, cognitive abilities. So as you see them there, it's important, as I said earlier, to ensure that our general educators and as much as our special education staff, that we're aware that it is that true two-prong approach, that we have the gap in learning and that's associated directly with that processing disorder in one or more of these areas. Because without that processing disorder, it's time for more interventions, perhaps, times to have different conversations, because that gap in academic skills may be due to, again, being a multilingual learner or having other learning needs, other needs for supports for extrinsic factors, more inclusion, more support of the ELD standards, more understanding of the ELA, ELD frameworks on behalf of staff to support the student close those gaps. But again, only when there's also a processing disorder can we truly say that the student has a specific learning disability. Because what we can say is a learning disability, any learning disability, is not primarily due to limited school experience or poor school attendance, not due to environmental culture difference or economic disadvantage, as we do serve students of various different economic advantages or disadvantages. Low SES, again, not a reason for referral. Maybe students need more exposure, more support, more scaffolding, front loading, background knowledge, etc., etc. Intellectual disability and emotional disturbance have their own definitions specific to the Ed code related to each. But let's speak specifically here to limited English proficiency. Limited English proficiency in and of itself, and I think I mentioned this early on in this session, is not a reason for referral. Limited English proficiency in and of itself is not a disability. But I want to highlight the fine print there. I'm going to read it because I never want to mess up this language because it's very important. The normal process of English language development, as well as manifestations of dialect and social linguistic variants, should not be diagnosed as a disabling condition. Very important. Again, English language development, being a multilingual learner, is not the reason or the impetus for a referral for a 504, so under Americans with Disability Act, and it is not the reason for a referral for IDA either, for special education, because it is not a disability. It's a form of learning. It's a form of needing support. It is a civil right to ensure that all of our English learners receive comprehensive ELD, that we support their growth in the development of English language acquisition skills. So as we consider specific learning disability and the assessment process, and I know we've mentioned this before through the pre-referral and referral process, is ensuring that what is that area of suspected disability? Wherever the referral comes from, and anyone can refer a child for special education assessment, it's important for us to have that conversation of what is the area of a suspected disability so that we can ensure comprehensive assessment and meet all of these requirements that are in statute. So it's very clear that our assessment teams then need to assure that their evaluation procedures are culturally and linguistically appropriate to meet that referral reason. So this is where we are on this referral wheel. So as we think of SST to referral process, so the referral has come in, the identification of the student's targeted needs, so where interventions have been applied and supportive to the student. Pre-referral activities and interventions, including progress monitoring and data collection. So all of that information has now made its way to the assessment team. Referral for special education, for which then a determination needs to be made in 15 days, prior written notice, procedural safeguards to parents, and the assessment plan to that parent guardian. Because what we also know is that a parent guardian may or may not provide consent to that assessment plan. Should we not receive consent, then we continue with all of the interventions as designed to target the unique need of that child, because this is an individualized process. But let's start with that referral that the student study team has identified as having additional needs, where the team has felt that it's more than second language acquisition. We suspect, so that team is saying, we affirm and suspect that this is a potential disability for which to engage the assessment team. At this point, if parent has agreed to the assessment plan. But before we send out that assessment plan, I want us to think about it. This intersectionality between English language proficiency skills and potential suspected disability category, this intersection can be quite difficult. Before the break, you had an opportunity to peruse language difference versus disability. And this is where assessment, deep dive assessments are so important to help disentangle, because it is definitely difficult to, again, unravel those confounding features of, is this English language development? Is this disability? And a thorough assessment process will assist you in making that determination. And it'll start with the development of the assessment plan, ensuring, of course, that that assessment plan is easily understood by the parent guardian, so in the parent guardian's primary language, that they're able to provide informed consent. That's very important. The parents actually are fully informed of, what is this referral? What is this assessment? What does this assessment entail? Explain the type assessments to be conducted, and that no IEP, no individualized education plan, will result from this assessment without the consent of the parent. So again, very important, needing parent guardian consent to move forward with that assessment. So when we consider, again, what assessment tools am I going to select? How am I going to shape this assessment and evaluation process? It's important to be clear on this education code. Assessments are administered in the child's native language or other mode of communication in the form most likely to yield accurate information, that we're truly gathering and garnering what students know and can do, academically, developmentally, functionally. And then, yes, there is that last clause, unless it's clearly not feasible to do so. What we encourage, what we recommend, what's anticipated is that teams will do everything possible to assure that students are assessed in their primary language or primary mode of communication, so that the data truly is accurate. That it would be the few and far between scenarios where, if the assessor themselves is not bilingual or not fluent, that we consider other measures. And I'm going to talk about that in just a little bit. So what's our first best option? So you may be an assessor that says, well, I'm fully bilingual. Like, I can say I'm a bilingual assessor, and yet I'm only bilingual in my primary language, right? I'm only bilingual in assessment practices in Spanish. Recognizing that across the state, you may have multiple dialects, multiple languages at your respective school site, and you may not have a fluent bilingual school psychologist, SLP, teacher, etc. on that assessment team that can fully assess students in their primary language. So it's very important that we also recognize that even within languages, there are multiple dialects, and that becomes difficult as well. So let's consider that first best option. Then when we consider cross-cultural non-discriminatory assessment that align to the referral concerns. I think that's important, because we come back to that student study team and why it's so important that those teams have had an ample discussion about, what is the area of suspected disability? Why are we assessing? That will help shape and inform that assessment process. But what we can say is that when we assess students in their primary language, again, we have a more robust idea of what that suspected disability is, if there is a potential processing disorder, how that impacts learning, how that impacts the student's learning directly in the classroom, and then we can plan accordingly. So when we think about beginning that assessment process, engaging with parents and guardians will be important, engaging with staff. Getting observational data, structured interviews will definitely inform that assessment process. In as much as we want to know what the student can and cannot do, it's important to also know in primary language, in their child's L1, in their primary language, what are any obstacles that the student's facing? When we think about caregivers, parents, guardians who also communicate with the child in their primary language, do they see deficits in learning, deficits in communication, processing, understanding? All of this data will inform our practice as we want to ensure that our assessments are culturally and linguistically appropriate. So is our first best option that we have a bilingual assessor using bilingual instruments? Yes, in that child's primary language. That would be our very first best option, that we would have the ability to have a bilingual assessor in that child's primary language and dialect using assessment tools in that child's primary language and dialect. But we know that those aren't always the easiest things to do, especially in California. So then what is our next best option? If it's not feasible to engage in first best assessment options for English learners because there's no assessor available in the primary language, our second option is to use a trained interpreter translator. Someone who can provide direct translation of the assessments. The assessments are in that child's primary language, and we document any limitations of that assessment in the report. So that second option is that we're again using assessments in that child's primary language and dialect, and the assessor is assessing in English, but there's that direct translation. It's direct, not summarized, but direct translation in that child's primary language and dialect. Our third option, however, is potentially where the assessor is utilizing, again, a translator interpreter in the primary language of the student to provide oral translation of an assessment that's written in English. And we see this, I think, more common where, again, we know and recognize that assessment batteries are not in all languages. They're not translated and normed and validated in other languages and dialects. So that's important as we select those assessment tools and build our assessment plan to ensure that we're using multiple measures. And are those multiple measures available in that child's primary language or dialect? And if not, that we document that we will use these assessments and that we have the availability of a translator in that child's primary language. We also have that fourth option, assess in English, to include nonverbal areas of cognition. And yes, as assessors, it may be that you're using nonverbal assessments, and yet we know that we have an obligation and a responsibility to assess with multiple measures. We don't make decisions based on one assessment tool, one interpretation of that assessment tool, because that would invalidate, again, our responsiveness and ensuring that, again, we've looked at multiple measures to make a true decision with validity and reliability that this child, in fact, has a disability. So thinking about the array of assessment tools that are available is important for that selection early on, and what type of assessment practices as you plan your assessment process. From the administrator lens, as you're listening, if you're an administrator, an EL specialist, you may be thinking and considering, given your respective community, what languages and dialects are representative in your community? Do you have the availability of bilingual assessors? And or can you provide support to your assessors by ensuring that there is a list of bilingual translators available to them? Do the assessors know how to access those translators, interpreters, to ensure that they feel supported and they can work with those translators to then again assure that assessments are culturally and linguistically appropriate? So it really is all of us working together and ensuring, because we will need to prepare. So anytime the use of an interpreter translator is utilized for assessment, they're worth their weight in gold. They absolutely are, because if you don't have bilingual assessors, we want to ensure that we're investing in the support of translators. And in that respect, identifying what tests, briefing and debriefing with those interpreters, ensuring that they do have the same language and dialect as the student, because we may have different verbal representations of different objects, items, themes, context, etc., given the cultural background, given the item, and different dialects and languages that are represented in California. Be prepared for for extra time. I think we all know that. In some languages, it takes that much more words to explain or to review. We're going to document all of that accordingly in our reports. And after administration, we ensure that we debrief with the interpreter because it may be that the translator picked up on some additional cues, context clues, or actually says, oh, the student responded in this way. And you're thinking, oh, okay, that actually makes sense given the basal and the ceiling and the type of assessment that I'm giving. And it may be that I'm not going to later report standardized scores because we did navigate away from the actual assessment tool and we were gathering more information. We use more of a dynamic type of assessment. That happens as well. And utilizing that interpreter to share information with you, to help you gather all of the information that the student relayed is so important. So here we have a tool, a support, if you will, to our assessors, which is the English Learner Student Questionnaire. I think this is a great tool as you're starting to build that rapport with the student whom you're going to assess. You could have it translated in different languages if necessary. You may have an interpreter translator with you as you ask these questions, as your assessors ask these questions of the student to be assessed, because it definitely helps to get a better understanding of the student's comfort and ability in their L1 as opposed to their L2. I think it's sometimes deceiving sometimes because students may have lots of social vocabulary. You may have heard of Bix versus Calp, Cummins' work, excellent to refer back to. Because students, again, it may seemingly appear that they are able to navigate the classroom, have social conversations on the playground, in the hallways, in assemblies, etc. But when we look to actual academic California standards-based language, content, that's where the difficulties lie. So it's easy for us to say, oh, that child must have, English skills. The parent just wrote it wrong on the home language survey. But are we sure? How do we know? Have we assessed in the L1? More than likely you haven't. So that's what we need to do through this assessment process, is to truly dig a little deeper. Actually analyze and assess and evaluate, get a better understanding of what L1 looks like. Because again, if the child truly has a disability, it will be evident in their primary language as well as the secondary language. And again, speaking to multiple measures, norm reference, criterion reference, systematic observation, structured interviews, all of these data points will inform your assessment practices. We need multiple measures to truly make informed decisions with, again, validity and reliability to say that the student truly has a disability, that perhaps being a second language learner. So multi-language learner is the secondary factor, but it's not the primary reason. It's not primary. Perhaps you have identified that, in fact, there is a disability within one of those 13 disability categories. So the more information we're able to gather, we have a more robust understanding of, does the student truly have a disability? So let's try an FAQ. So in the chat box, don't be shy. And those of us in person, you can say yes, thumbs up, no, thumbs down, or, and I don't know. It's okay to say I'm not sure. It's definitely okay to say I'm not sure. So let's look at this Q&A question. May the parent waive the requirement for a student to be assessed for special education in that child's primary language? So can a parent waive and say, it's okay. Go ahead and assess in English. I see my in-person friends. How about our Zoom friends? Go ahead and just waterfall in the chat. Yes, no, maybe so. What do you think? May a parent waive the requirement? All right, the FAQ says, no, the parent cannot waive the requirement. So thank you everyone for being honest, for your candor, for sharing. It's making me like scratching like, wait a second. But maybe this child has had formal education in the US since like kindergarten, second grade, but they're still long-term English learners. That may in fact be the case. But the student has receptively gathered information in their primary language. They've been exposed to another language other than English. And it's for us to then uncover that. We have an ethical responsibility as an assessment team. And remember I said we, because back in the way back, I was a school psychologist, so I often say we. But we have an obligation to test and assess, evaluate, given all forms of information that we have. So ethically, we have a responsibility to identify what are those impacts of the primary. We need to, again, disentangle that intersectionality of English learner needs versus need as a result from a disability, because we want, again, accurate information about what students can do. What do they know and what do they can do? So as we think about assessment, academic development, function, and of course communication, only when it's completely not feasible to do so would I say then we revert to all nonverbal assessment or other types of assessment. And there may be situations like that. There are languages that, small pockets of communities across California where maybe there's a primary language that doesn't have, it's not a language that has a written dialect, that again, very difficult, very unique. Document all of that information. But again, as kind-hearted as some parents are, we need to stay true to the work and ethically assess with cultural and linguistic validity. And that includes non-discriminatory evaluation. So I'm actually going to hand it over to Christina, who's going to finish out this segment. Thank you.
Okay. Hi, everyone. So moving forward, we're going to start covering components of a non-discriminatory evaluation. So again, as assessors and multidisciplinary teams, and even if you're an administrator, these are components that we want to ensure are part of a comprehensive evaluation for English language learners. We want to ensure that our instruments that we're using are valid. They're assessing those areas of suspected disability that we may have in question. Also, the tools that we're using are evaluating those specific areas of strengths and weaknesses. And we're not just looking at our students in terms of a global IQ score. Those are practices that we don't like to just represent our children as an IQ score, but really looking at what are their strengths, what are their areas of weakness, and both socially, academically, and really that we're adding those components to the assessment. Also, to ensure that we're using instruments that are measuring, what their true skills are, that we're not there, that our instruments are sound in the fact that they're not measuring their limited English proficiency, where they're at in those areas. Also, ensuring that we're touching upon their limited school experience. So if you're identifying students that have excessive absences, that you're identifying that in the report, you're discussing that as a team, and also districts, the bullet point discussing that districts may ask for the child if the child has a diagnosis. That's additional information that should be part of the report. But again, we're not waiting for a diagnosis to move forward with the evaluation. So if parents are saying that a student is getting evaluated by some other practitioner, that the district is still held liable to that 60-day timeline in order to complete the assessment. If an additional diagnosis were to come to light after the fact, it's very appropriate to hold an additional meeting, and maybe that assessment needs to be amended with new information and bring the team back together to discuss any new medical concerns or diagnosis. Also, there needs to be some discussion in the evaluation that includes how will the student be involved in the general education setting. So that's something that the team always needs to also discuss when looking at the process of evaluating the student and how their progress and functioning is related to the general education curriculum. Appendix 4.1 is an additional great tool, part of the practitioner's guide. You can click on it, explore it right here, but it is a list of assessment tools for assessing, students that are English learners. And really, it would be a great opportunity to explore this tool to see what kind of tools you may have missing in your toolbox. Maybe you want to discuss with your administrator, director of special education, and go through this list. It's not an exhaustive list, but it really may help in ensuring that you have adequate tools and appropriate tools when conducting assessments of English learners. So, and if there's anybody in the chat, if you're looking through this list, if there are additional assessments that you may be aware of, you can share them in the chat. If you're not identifying them on this list, we'd like to see about, always updating and getting you information to share with our practitioners. Moving forward, again, the assessment process, although we probably typically think of the school psychologist as being the lead for evaluating our students, we really need to also remember that the evaluation process really should be conducted in a multidisciplinary team approach. So for you all to think about, what do your teams look like at your sites? Are you having SST meetings, or are you having IEP meetings with the different practitioners that are involved in assessing English learners? We're not all experts in the world of English language development. If we're a special education teacher or if we're a school psychologist, it's really our ethical responsibility to come together so that we're sharing all our expertise and looking at the student and their progress through multiple lenses, in order to ensure that we're covering all of our bases and looking at the trajectory of the student in their journey of acquiring English as a second language, looking at their educational history. Does our nurse need to be involved if the student has an extensive medical health background that may need some interpretation from the expertise of our school nurse? Those are really the best practices when completing these assessments. And also your school psychologist, your speech and language specialist, your occupational therapist, everyone's coming together to share results of a student, but really it is the IEP team's decision to come together and look at all of the data and attempt to synthesize it in order to determine if the student is qualifying and meets criteria as having a disability. Additional tools to support the team can be found in the practitioner's guide. One of the components in evaluation process requirements in the law is that observational data is gathered and included in a comprehensive evaluation. So these are excellent tools that can be utilized by the team in order to add all of this information to help us make better informed decisions when determining eligibility. Let's see. So Appendix 4.2 is the English Learner Parent Questionnaire. This is an excellent tool to use with parents in order to get a history of the students' acquisition of their primary language. Were there any concerns or deficits that were identified early on in development? Let's see, and their background and history with language. If they are new to the U.S., what kind of instruction did they receive in prior years? These are components that can be acquired with the parent and really helps you facilitate and build relationships with the parents, that you're involving them in a meaningful manner in the entire evaluation process. Who knows the child better than the parent? And what they're doing at home, what kind of language they're receiving at home, what kind of receptive language skills have they developed over time. And then Appendix 4.4 is a questionnaire for the English learner teacher. So are we interviewing the teacher that's providing that designated ELD support to the student? For yes. Uh-huh. It actually, that's an excellent question. So it can be used in both the pre-referral process or during the evaluation process, because like our friend here had mentioned, a lot of times parents will submit a letter requesting an evaluation. So it's still, despite the fact that maybe all of those pre-referral activities hadn't been conducted. Maybe the parent is, you offer that SST meeting to go over the parent's concerns. What are the areas of suspected disability that the parent is bringing up? And it's really our ethical responsibility to go back and conduct these use these observational tools to gather as much information on their history of English language development and their second language acquisition history, what it looks like in their instruction that they're receiving during their designated ELD time. So that's a great question, but it can be used in both settings, both the pre-referral process or during the evaluation 60-day timeline process. And these are tools, again, for the team in order to gather as much information as we can so that we're making the informed decisions that are really helping us avoid over-identification of a student in special education, and also under-identifying. So again, thank you for your question. And really, also there's several tools, right? So I think if you're working together as a team, it's not just having the school psychologist be responsible for gathering all of this information and all of these different data tools and observation tools. It really, I kind of think that maybe perhaps an EL coordinator would conduct an evaluation in the during the time that the child is receiving designated ELD. Or is there a general education teacher that could observe the student during complete a questionnaire during English language instruction or on the playground, because it's really the team's responsibility to present how the student is functioning across different settings. And again, it is part of Ed Code that we observe the student across multiple settings and have that be part of the assessment and comprehensive evaluation. Again, these are tools for you all to use and make copies of, utilize them with your teams, but they're just excellent tools that I personally, in my history as a school psychologist and in my past, I wish I would have had this, many years ago, because it really breaks it down and helps you guide what you're looking for. So it's not just kind of, okay, go off in, the broad term of observe in multiple settings. But this really kind of guides our observations and really lends itself to allow other team members to be part of the process so that students aren't being looked at by just one person and the determination isn't just coming from one person. But moving forward, Appendix 4.6 is an English learner classroom observation checklist. And then we also have the observation checklist or form of the student when they're participating in and receiving instruction in English. And then I'd like to bring your attention to Appendix 4.8, as it is another tool to utilize with the parent. So parent report individual education program development. So although that's not every student that is referred for special education will qualify for services, an IEP will be developed within that 60-day timeline. So this tool helps you gather information from the parent to add to that IEP that will be developed no matter what. Because once they're assessed within 60 days, the IEP team is meeting to determine whether or not they qualify for special education services. And it's really it will do wonders for your relationship with parents as well, is that throughout the process, you're keeping them involved and informed and what it's looking like. We don't ever want to blindside a parent as well. We'd never want to just show up to a meeting with multiple educators and have the parent there and say they don't qualify and really not have a plan. So I think when you're meeting with the parent throughout the process, you're also kind of sharing like they may not qualify for special education services. They may not need it, but there may still be some gaps that they're presenting because of their limited English language development at that point. So we're gonna talk about what will that look like if the child doesn't qualify for services, because we never want parents to ever feel that it's if they don't qualify for special education, then their child is not going to be supported. That's really, again, as a team, knowing that throughout the process is like, what would happen and what additional supports will the child receive if the child does not qualify for services. Moving forward, so here is a link to the IDEA required evaluation procedures. It outlines what are the components that are required in a comprehensive evaluation of all students that are referred for special education. And as an assessor, we're constantly asking ourselves these questions. Are our tools valid, reliable? Is all the data and information that I'm gathering, is it comprehensive? Are we assessing as a team in all areas of suspected disability? I know in this presentation so far we've been talking mainly about specific learning disability, but again, as I'm assessing, are other concerns developing? Are there other areas of the various disabilities that a child can qualify under? Are there other things that are popping up that the student may be presenting? And do I kind of have to shift? Does the team have to shift and maybe look at any health impairments that may be impacting their learning and progress? So again, that's always kind of something that you're thinking about as a team, is if we're covering and outlining all areas of weakness that the student may be presenting, and if we're identifying those areas and addressing them as we complete the assessment. And coming together with all of the data that we've been gathering with all of our tools, really use those 60 days to meet with your multidisciplinary team to review the data. If you have questions, don't be afraid to reach out to your school psychologist. If you're a special education teacher, your speech and language specialist, everyone should be taking the time to bring their data together so that we're not showing up to an IEP in silos and kind of having things reported to the parent in different sections. Really, we want to be able to take the time to bring our data together and really analyze it and see, is the student, is there more data that we need? Is it identifying significant needs where the child is going to require special education? Are they making progress towards ELD standards? Are we able to articulate that and identify that in the report? And so again, I know that the 60-day timeline goes by very quickly, but it's really, I think it goes a long way if there is a time where the team meets to analyze this data. And here are the minimum requirements that are outlined in Ed Code that are required for all students that are referred for special education. So all students that are referred for special education, when they are assessed, these are the minimum requirements that need to be outlined and identified in the assessment report. There's a statement discussing if the student needs special education, because as you know, a student can have a disability or they can have a medical condition that doesn't necessarily deem them that they qualify for special education or related services. So that's what we're looking at with the data. making the determination if they qualify for services and under what category of disability. Are we adding behavior and noting any of all of our observation data across various settings? What is the relationship of the student's behavior that they're presenting in school in relation to their academic and social functioning? Are there any deficits identified in those areas related to behavior? Are we addressing behavior and ensuring that we're looking at whether or not behavior is impeding their learning? Also, any health history or medical background that may be impacting their ability to make adequate progress. And again, looking at their effects of their environment, culture, and any economic disadvantage that may be identified that the assessor may want to make a statement about in terms of the evaluation. And if a student presents as having a low incidence disability, that the team is discussing or the assessor is discussing if any specialized services or materials or equipment is required. And so, as we just reviewed the minimum requirements in the evaluation for all students that are referred for special education, these are the best practices moving forward for students that are multilingual learners when we're assessing them. So we want to ensure that our evaluations are comprehensive and culturally and linguistically sound in the fact that we're discussing the impacts of language and culture on the students' learning. As you know, our students that are multilingual learners, they are extremely diverse. So we never just want to say, look at students that are English learners and assume that they kind of all have the same background. They come from the same, history or where they regarding their language acquisition, what kind of instruction they received in their primary language. We never want to make those types of assumptions. We really want to understand and keep in mind that each student is an individual with extremely individualized backgrounds. So ensuring that our reports are reflecting that. Also, how were standardized tests and measurements using those standardized assessments, how were they altered? Were they altered? Was their direct translation in a language that you may not be proficient in? That needs to be identified in the report. And it isn't anything to be ashamed of. It's just we want to be as transparent as possible in our evaluations. We want to paint a picture of what it looks like and what the assessment procedures were taken in order to determine eligibility. And also if the use of interpreters, what did that look like? What interpreters were used? How did you meet with the interpreter? I just think it's very important as an assessor is that we're just identifying all those various components that were used in order to do what we find ethically appropriate when assessing students and really determining and demonstrating that we were detangling the difference between a disability and a language difference. And also adding a statement regarding the examiner's level of language proficiency in the language of the student and the effect that may have had on test results and overall assessment. So again, if any standardized assessments were altered, if an interpreter was used, that we're identifying that in the report, and we may not be reporting on standardized scores, but that is all extremely useful data that helps us make better and informed decisions for the students' instruction moving forward. So now we're going back to, since we're in chapter 4. Okay, so we're right at the break time. So let's have a 10-minute break, and then when we return, we'll get started on the activity regarding Cruz. So let's set a timer for 10 minutes and we'll take a break. Okay, everyone, let's come back together. Our break, 10 minutes. Hope you got a quick break, drink of water, use the restroom, take a stretch break. So as we come back, moving forward, we're going to go back to the student scenario of Cruz. So if you can break up into teams here for our in-person participants, we're going to do an activity. It is linked here. We're going to follow the jigsaw processing activity. So everyone's going to read the assessing Cruz part together as a group, and then each of you take a section to divvy up, and you're going to review together these prompts. You're going to get together and read your part, your sections, and then come back together to identify the best practices that you saw in the student scenario. Discuss, are there additional assessments you would administer to Cruz? And furthermore, is there additional information you feel would be necessary to ensure Cruz's assessment is valid and comprehensive, given her cultural and linguistic background? So right now, we are going to take 15 minutes to engage in this activity. And I know those are friends participating via Zoom. You may have to engage in this activity independently, but again, this is an excellent activity to take back to your sites and work together in your MTSS teams or multidisciplinary teams to participate in this activity together. So I'm going to set a timer for 15 minutes, and you can all get started on the student scenario for Cruzita in chapter 4. And again, the link is there in the chat as well. Here, everyone, let's come back together after we've been meeting to discuss about Cruzita. Thank you for getting together, those of you in person in your teams. Are there any questions or anything that you'd like to share regarding the prompts that we shared with you? Anybody in the chat want to add anything? Feel free. Mr. Brooks.
Well, I don't know. I'm not a psychologist. I'm not a speech therapist.
You can use the mic.
Okay. I mean, maybe I'm stretching, but I'm not a psychologist or a speech therapist, but it just, going over it, I was wondering why they decided not to do like a speech evaluation if, parent said that, speech was a little delayed at beginning, the ear infections. Teacher kind of noted there was issues with blends. So just to kind of cover, I was wondering why that wasn't conducted. But again, like I said, I was not really a member, and I'm not a specialist in those areas, but that just that stuck out to me. Just little things that everybody was saying that I was like, well, maybe cover it.
And I agree with you. Thank you for sharing, Mr. Brooks, because that's really part of this exercise and activity so that we can kind of look at those different components and what are those areas that might be standing out to you, just like through the entire assessment process and gathering information of data, when we're looking through the CUME file or we're having interviews, if there's other areas of suspected disability, can that be added? Say we're within the middle of the timeline and that's an area that you see and identify as a concern, going back to the assessment team, sharing with parent if there were any concerns in the area of speech and language, if that is something that can be added to the assessment plan, or maybe the team moves forward and request for an extension to add that area of suspected disability, and maybe the team agrees that perhaps the assessment be extended with parent consent, and additional assessments and evaluation procedures are added. Thank you. Anybody else like to share? Here, hold on real quick. Let me pass this to you so that our Zoom friends can hear as well.
I guess what caught our eye is that everything was be done regularly, what we do in our district, But the one thing that caught my attention is that once we find the student with a disability of that the student qualifies, the student is immediately, kind of, okay, we agree, the student qualifies. But one of the things that is different here that it was cutting our attention is that they were just not going to keep all that data to determine, but they were going to go on and move on in creating a plan to make sure that if it's the disability that is causing the reading difficulties. I was sharing that pretty much we see that in special education with behavior. When there needs to be certain discipline. And we always meet and talk about it, but I was just sharing with her that this is the first time that I see it being applicable to academics.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing. That's great that you noticed that. And really this is to help, these tools and activities are to help you compare what your practices look like in your own district and within your own team. So thank you very much for sharing. And moving forward, here is a link to an amazing infographic. I hope that we try to give you as many tools and resources as possible to help you with these very intricate assessment procedures and ensuring that we're doing right by the students in our huge responsibility that we have in assessing students and determining whether or not they have a true disability. So if you click the link to this infographic, it gives you all of the components of conducting culturally and linguistically appropriate assessments. And it allows for you as assessment teams to get together and go through these steps. And all of the Ed code is outlined in these different components of, doing a file check, gathering kind of random samples of IEPs or psychoeducational reports of students with different linguistic backgrounds, and looking at the reports and the IEPs and ensuring that all of these components were completed. And this exercise and this infographic is to help support your practices at your respective LEAs. And really, it's not to, make anybody feel bad, but really help us grow in our practices of completing appropriate assessments and really trying to avoid over-identification of students that are multilingual learners and identifying them as having a disability. We really want, we have so much ability to ensure that we're providing the appropriate services that that students have the right to. So again, we don't want to over-identify students. As Debbie had shared with you, the data in California is about 47% of students that are receiving special education services are identified as having a specific learning disability. So this tool is a checklist to help you go through psychoeducational evaluations in your district and ensure that all of the legal components are there. And if they're not, what areas can we improve upon in order to help our assessments become more robust and comprehensive and appropriate and not over-identifying students that are English learners as having a disability, but really ensuring that they're receiving appropriate English language development supports prior to a referral. And if those of you that are practitioners, maybe school psychologists or speech and language specialists, if you'd like to move forward and really get more information regarding best practices and conducting appropriate assessments of English learners, we have a full day training conducted by Dr. Samuel Ortiz. And the link is here. You can also find it on our website, and the resources and full PowerPoint is also linked here as well. And he is just an expert in the field. So if you want to move forward and really hone your craft and do more research in the area of improving your practices and evaluation procedures, please feel free to access this resource. It's completely free, and there's also an amazing Q&A at the end of this video as well that was completed with Dr. Sam Ortiz. And also here is a link if those of you that are familiar with the cultural language interpretive matrix resource, there is a link to download the free resource to help you when analyzing your assessment data. That's available there. Oh, I don't know why I did that. Okay. And if anybody would like to share any new learnings or wonderings, please share them in the chat box. If there's any questions or comments you'd like to share with us, we'd love to engage with you and give you just a few moments to do so. Or if those of you in person have any further questions, please share. And again, in case you missed it, today we are meeting on all things in section 2 of the practitioner's guide. That's chapters 3 and 4 that we've covered today. If you were not here, we did have already a day where we covered section 1, chapters 1 and 2, all things pre-referral and conducting identifying English learners through our MTSS systems of support. So within the next few days, we will have the link to the recorded session. But I just wanted to remind you that we already met on all things section 1. If you have any questions, if you want to explore any resources that we covered today, please visit us at our website. Here is a link to our website. You can find all the resources and links in right here linked in our website. And if you have any further questions, we'd love to engage with you and provide you with any support. We don't want to make you feel like this was the only time that you're able to ask questions. If there's things that come up when you meet with your respective teams as you return to your sites, please feel free to reach out to us and email us here or tweet us. So again, if you have any questions, we're always available to help you and your teams all across the state of California. And that's it for today. So we are finishing a little bit early today. I hope that is not an inconvenience for anybody, but we want to thank you again. I didn't think so, but we want to thank you again for joining us. And we look forward to our next meeting as we cover the subsequent sections of the practitioner's guide. And I believe we're meeting until January. All right. So thank you, everyone. And yeah, thank you. So have a great day.